In the autumn of 1348, people in London went to bed healthy and woke up dying. A fever would strike without warning. Dark swellings appeared in their groins, under their arms and along the neck. Within days, sometimes hours, entire households were gone. Church bells rang so often that parishes gave up counting the dead and simply rang for whoever still lived. Graveyards overflowed, streets fell silent, and across the city, one question hung over every timber roof and stone wall. Was this the end of the world? What people in 1348 could not know was that they were living through the greatest catastrophe in human history. The Black Death, the apocalyptic pandemic that would kill half of Europe's population in less than 5 years. It arrived in London, like a plague from Revelation itself, carried across seas, transmitted by invisible agents no one understood, and unstoppable by any prayer, remedy, or quarantine medieval medicine could devise. To understand how London became a city of mass graves and empty houses, we have to understand the world the plague invaded. Medieval London in 1348 was not the romantic setting of legend. It was a dense, chaotic, thriving metropolis of perhaps 80,000 souls, one of the largest cities north of the Alps. Narrow lanes, twisted between timber houses that leaned dangerously over the streets, their upper floors jutting out so far that neighbors could shake hands across the gap. The sky above was a thin strip of grey between overhanging roofs. London was the beating commercial heart of England. Ships from Flanders, France, and the Mediterranean crowded the Thames. Markets at Cheapside and East Cheap sold wool, spices, salted fish, and wine. Guilds controlled every trade, from goldsmiths to tanners. The city hummed with life, ambition, and filth. Human waste and animal offal ran down open gutters in the center of streets. Pigs roamed freely, eating garbage. Wells stood feet away from cesspits. Butchers tossed entrails into the Thames. Rats thrived in the dark spaces between buildings, in the thatched roofs, in the grain warehouses along the docks. Medieval Londoners had no concept of bacteria or vectors of disease. They believed illness came from miasma, corrupted air released by rotting matter or astrological misalignment. They didn't realize that their city, with its density, filth, and thriving rat population, was a perfect incubator for the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The stage was set. All that was needed was a spark. That spark arrived by ship. In the summer of 1348, merchant vessels from plague-ravaged ports in France and the Low Countries docked along the Thames. Officials had heard terrifying rumors from the continent, entire towns vanishing, bodies piling in the streets, families dying together in single nights. But trade was too valuable to stop. Cargo was unloaded. Barrels of wine and bales of wool were hauled onto London's wharves, and with them came the true passengers. Black rats and the fleas on their backs, carrying a microscopic killer. The first deaths appeared in the poorest riverside parishes, places like St. Botolph and Queen Hythe, where dock workers, sailors, and labourers lived packed together in crumbling tenements. At first, the symptoms were dismissed as spotted fever or flux, but the bodies told a different story. Victims burned with sudden fever, vomited black bile, and developed agonizing swellings in their groin, armpits, and neck, buboes filled with blood and pus. In many cases, the infection spread into the bloodstream, turning fingers and toes black with gangrene. Death followed within days, sometimes within hours. For a few weeks, London tried to ignore the horror. Markets stayed open. Churches held their services. The wealthy continued their business in guild halls and counting houses, but the numbers grew too large to hide. Parish clerks kept mortality rolls, and the lists grew longer each week. By October 1348, it was undeniable. The Great Pestilence had arrived in London. Medieval medicine was completely helpless. The most educated physicians in England, trained at Oxford and influenced by Arabic texts, believed the plague was caused by a catastrophic alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 that had corrupted the air. They prescribed bleeding, purging, and lancing the buboes, treatments that only weakened patients further. They told people to avoid bathing, believing open pores invited corrupted air. They burned aromatic herbs like rosemary and juniper in the streets, creating thick clouds of smoke that did nothing to stop the fleas biting in the shadows. Some doctors fled the city entirely. Others stayed and died alongside their patients. Apothecaries sold useless concoctions, powdered emerald, crushed toad, vinegar mixed with garlic. Astrologers blamed the stars. Priests blamed sin. No one understood that the enemy was a bacterium, carried by fleas on rats moving silently through the very infrastructure of the city. As winter approached, the plague exploded. Medieval London was designed to spread disease. Families lived in single rooms, sharing beds with children, servants, and apprentices. Animals were stabled on the ground floor, directly below living quarters. Rats nested in thatched roofs and burrowed between timber beams. When one person in a household fell ill, the infection spread to everyone within days. Entire families were found dead in their beds, bodies already cold and blackened. The streets changed. The clatter of carts and shouts of merchants faded. In their place came the sound of wailing, the shuffle of funeral processions, and the constant tolling of church bells. At first, parishes tried to bury the dead with proper rites, prayers, coffins, consecrated ground. But the numbers overwhelmed them. Churchyards filled. Gravediggers couldn't dig fast enough. Bodies lay in houses for days, rotting because there was no one to carry them away. The social fabric of London began to tear. Servants abandoned their masters. Children were left orphaned, wandering the streets. Landlords fled to country estates, leaving tenants to die alone. Shops closed. Bakeries stopped baking. The intricate web of guild labor, contracts, and commerce collapsed. The city that had thrived on trade and human connection was now a place where contact meant death. The church, the spiritual backbone of medieval life, faced an existential crisis. People packed into churches, praying for deliverance, crowding together in ways that only spread the disease faster. Priests administered last rites to hundreds, knowing they too would likely fall ill. Many clergy died at extraordinary rates, perhaps 40% or more, because they refused to abandon their flocks. When prayers failed and holy men died as quickly as sinners, faith itself was tested. Some doubled down on piety, convinced that only repentance could save them. Others grew cynical, wondering if God had abandoned them. Public processions wound through the streets, barefoot penitents chanting psalms and whipping themselves in displays of extreme devotion. These flagellants believed they could take the sins of the city onto their own flesh and appease divine wrath. But all they accomplished was to gather crowds and spread infection further. As the death toll mounted, London ran out of space to bury its dead. The small parish churchyards could hold no more. Emergency measures were taken. Outside the city walls, in a field near Smithfield, officials opened a vast plague pit. Hundreds of bodies were brought there daily, stacked in trenches, covered with thin layers of lime and soil. Another mass grave was dug near the tower. The dead were no longer individuals with names and families. They were anonymous cargo, piled like firewood and covered over. Witnesses described scenes that seemed torn from apocalyptic prophecy. Streets, once crowded with life, stood empty except for the occasional corpse, left in a doorway. Shops were shuttered, their owners either dead or fled. Packs of feral dogs roamed, feeding on the unburied. Rats, emboldened by the lack of human presence, swarmed openly in broad daylight. The smell of death and decay hung over the city like a fog, mixing with the smoke from fires burned to purify the air. By early 1349, London was a hollowed-out shell. Perhaps 1 in 3 residents was dead. Some estimates put the toll even higher. Entire guilds were decimated. Craft workshops stood empty. Wealthy merchant families that had ruled the city for generations were wiped out. Children who lost their parents to the plague became orphans overnight, left to fend for themselves or taken in by strangers. The survivors walked through a city that felt haunted, every corner a reminder of who was missing. The plague didn't discriminate. Nobles died alongside beggars. Bishops fell alongside street cleaners. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself succumbed to the disease. Wealth could buy a country estate to flee to, but even there, the plague often followed. The only real protection was isolation, and even that was uncertain. The bacterium moved along trade routes, rivers and roads with relentless efficiency, and then, as suddenly as it had come, the first wave began to recede. By the summer of 1349, the death toll in London slowed, not because anyone had found a cure or understood the cause, but because the disease had simply run out of easy victims. Those who survived had either been lucky, possessed some natural resistance, or had managed to avoid exposure. The fleas that carried Yersinia pestis grew less active in warmer, drier months. The remaining population had thinned enough that transmission became harder. London emerged from the Black Death, transformed. The survivors walked streets that felt vast and empty. Houses stood abandoned, their doors open to the wind. Shops that had been in families for generations had no heirs. Fields around the city lay untended. Entire villages in the surrounding countryside were deserted, their populations erased. But life, stubborn and resilient, began to return. The survivors inherited the city. Property values collapsed. Suddenly, there was more housing than people. Labor became scarce and valuable. Peasants and laborers, once bound to their land and trades, found they could demand higher wages. The rigid, feudal structures that had defined medieval England began to crack. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed an entire social order. Over the following decades, the plague would return in smaller waves, never again as devastating as 1348, but enough to remind London that the world had permanently changed. The population wouldn't fully recover for more than a century. The psychological scars lasted even longer. Art became obsessed with death. The dance of death, skeletons leading popes, kings and beggars to the grave, became a common motif, a reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. Medieval Londoners didn't have the words bacteria or epidemic, but they understood trauma. They had watched half their city die in less than a year, had buried their families in mass graves, and had faced the collapse of every system they trusted: medicine, religion, government, economy. They emerged into a world that looked the same, but felt irrevocably different. Looking back from the modern era, it's easy to treat the Black Death as ancient history, plague pits, medieval superstition, mass graves. But the questions Londoners faced in 1348 sound uncomfortably familiar. What happens when disease overwhelms every system? How do people behave when fear becomes daily reality? Who gets to flee and who is forced to stay? How do societies rebuild after catastrophic loss? The Black Death turned London into a city of the dead, a place where the very density and energy that made it powerful became instruments of destruction. But it also revealed something enduring about urban life. The same networks that spread disease can later carry recovery, reform, and resilience. The streets of 1348 were filled with suffering, ignorance, and despair. But they also produced eyewitness chronicles, public health experiments, and eventually a determination to rebuild. This was London. That's 1348, a city that lost half its people in a single year, where graveyards overflowed and streets fell silent, where every door might hide a corpse and every breath might be your last. Once the Black Death began, there was no escape. Yet, from those mass graves and empty houses grew the outline of a new world, one forced to adapt, to question, and to remember. To walk through London today is to walk over a city that has already survived its greatest test. The plague pits are still there, buried beneath parks and car parks. The Black Death left a warning carved into the foundations of the modern world. Civilization is fragile, and catastrophe is always closer than we think.